Hello, and welcome to Peter Presents Iliad, episode 2.5, The Ships. It's finally here, everybody. Now, if you're watching this in the playlist, you might wonder why suddenly I have a much bigger beard and why the date under this video is so much later than episode 2. Well, a lot of lies have been told around this table, but yeah, it ended up taking me a lot longer to do this episode than I thought. At first, it was because the number of names in this book, in book 2 for the ships and the battle order for the Trojans, there are just so many of them, and they're so crazy and hard to pronounce and know how to pronounce. And so there was that. And then I started to do more research on this part of the book. And everybody skips this part of the book, but then I delved into it and found out it's one of the most interesting parts of the book. And then it just kind of got away from me as well. You know, excuses. You don't care. But honestly, we got a lot to do, so let's go through it. Now, the reading for this episode is a little different. And because this is one of the things I wanted to do. I think I may have mentioned in one of the episodes up to this point that the way that Iliad was presented was through song. One of the reasons why people could memorize this massive work was because it's Greek poetry, and it's easier to memorize in Greek, but it also had a meter to it, I think is the right term, and where there would be someone with a drum or 2 sticks or a staff to keep a beat. And they'd tell the story to the beat. And it was a way to have a rhythm with it, which I think is fantastic. Now, obviously, when we translate this to English, it doesn't always have that same rhythm to it. It depends on the translation, but as we've said before, Stanley Lombardo's translation, my favorite, doesn't really try to stay true to the rhythm of Iliad in the same way. And it services the translation in a more visceral, emotional way, I think, along with other things. You know, it's I encourage you to get a copy of this. Once again, it's my last chance to tell y'all to get a copy of this book. So I highly recommend, link in the description below. I'm pleased that some of you in the comments have actually said that you've purchased a copy of this. So awesome. I don't get any bonus from that. I'm not sponsored by them. I just, you know, they gave me permission to use this translation, and so any chance I can get to plug, I do it. For the role of the ships, we are starting in Book 2, line 522, and that goes until line 873. And I want to do this one a little differently, so I want to kind of set the scene. I want you to imagine over 1,000 years ago, over 2,000 years ago, you've traveled far from your home in the mountains. You've been waiting all day. You've heard about what's coming. A man has come to Delphi who's going to do a special recitation at the amphitheater. And the seats are all filled up by the richer people, but you're higher up on the cliffs and the acoustics are perfect. I know, I've been there. I've sung there, and I've heard my older sister sing more than 100 yards below me, and I could understand and hear everything she said. Brilliant stuff. You're there with your family. You've heard this story told to you sort of before, in the same way that today we might say a movie's been described to us, but we haven't seen the movie yet, but we're excited for it. It's dark. Fires are lit. People are excited. There's been food. There's been drink. And then the man who comes out begins to tell Iliad. And hearing this man give this speech, this recitation, is just the most incredible thing you've heard. It's like seeing your favorite character on screen for the first time when you hear this man talk about that character showing up. The audience cheers for their favorite, or when their town is named. And then finally, the only sound you can hear aside from his voice and the beat of his drum is the crackles from the fires. And he gets to the opening credit roll after the opening setup of Iliad. And this is the ships. Let's see if we can do that.
Tell me now, muses, who live on Olympus, for you are goddesses and are present and know all things, while we hear only reports and know nothing. Who were the Greek captains and lords? The rank and file I could never name, not even if I had 10 tongues, 10 mouths, a voice that never broke, and a bronze heart. Unless the Olympian muses, daughters of Zeus, call to my mind all those who came under Ilion's walls. Now I will call the roll of the ships. The Boeotians were led by Peneleus and Leitus, with Arcesilas, Protenor, and Clonius. Their towns were Hyria, Rachialis, and Scinus, Scolus, Rigdidionius, Thespia, Graia, Broadmicalistus, Harma, Elasion, Ithrae, Elian, Hyle, Pateon, Ocalia, Median, Copia, Tresus, Dove-coated Thisbe, Coranea, Grassy, Heliartus, Platea, Glesis, Lower Thebes, and Kistus, Posidion with its grove, and Arne its vineyards, Medea, sacred Nisa, and on the coast, Anthedon! 50 ships, and aboard each ship, 120 young men of Boeotia. The minions from Aspledon and Orchomenos were led by Ascalaphus and Ialmenus, sons of Ares, born to Astyoche, then a virgin in the palace of Actor, son of Asius, when she had the god in her upstairs room. There 30 vessels were drawn up in rows. The Phocians were led by Scidius and Epistrophus, sons of Ephetus, grandsons of Nobilus. Their towns were Cyparissus and rocky Pytho, sacred Crisa, Dallas, Panopius, Anamoria, Hyampolis, and on the river Cephisus and Lelea, by the springs of Cephisus. 40 black ships formed their contingent, and their leaders marshaled their ranks left of the Boeotians as they readied for war. The Locrians were led by swift Ajax, son of Oileus, not as great as Telamonian Ajax, not nearly. A small man who wore a linen corselet, but with a spear, the best soldier in Greece. They lived in Sinus, and Ophis, and Calliaris, and Bessa, and Scarphe, and lovely Agiae, and Tarphe, and Thronium by the streams of Boagrius. Ajax led 40 black ships, manned by Locrians who dwell over against sacred Euboea. The Abantes who held Euboea and Chalcis, Eretria, and the vineyards of Histiae, seaside Cerinthus, and the steep stronghold of Dios. And those in Ceristus and also in Styra were led by Elephenor, a scion of Ares and son of Chalcodon. He was chief of the Abantes, a spirited people, swift and hot-tempered, their hair long in the back, spearmen eager with outstretched spears to rend enemy corselets. 40 black ships followed Elephenor, those who held Athens, the well-founded citadel, and the land of Erechtheus, whom Athena fostered after the grain field bore him and made him live in her own rich precinct, where Athenian youths still propitiate him yearly with rams and bulls. These these were led by Menestheus, Peteo's son. This man had no equal anywhere on earth at marshaling chariots and infantry, rivaled only by Nestor, who was his elder. 50 black ships followed Menestheus. Ajax led from Salamis 12 ships and stationed them by the Athenian contingent, those who held Argos and walled Tyrrhenes and Hermione and Acine on the deep gulf, Trojan and Ioniae and vine-clad Epidaurus and the Achaean youths and Agane and masses. All these were led by Diomedes and Sthenelus, son of Capaneus, with Euryalus as a third, but the commander-in-chief was Diomedes, and 80 black ships followed him. Those who held Mycenae's citadel, and wealthy Corinth, and those in Cleonae, and in Orneae, and lovely Erythrae, and in Sicyon, where Adrastus first was king, and those in Hypericiae, and steep Genose, and in Pellene, and around Agium, throughout all Agialius, and around wide Helice. All these were commanded, 100 ships, by Lord Agamemnon, son of Atreus. His contingent was far the largest and best, and among them he put on his gleaming bronze, glorying, preeminent among all, and the army he led was the largest of all. Those who lived in Lacedaemon's gulches, in Pharis, and Sparta, in dove-haunted Messe, and those in Brisae, and lovely Agiae, and Amyclae, and Hellas, a citadel by the sea, and those in Laos, and environs of Oitylis. These were led by Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus, whose voice carried in battle, in 60 ships marshaled separately, and he moved among them with confidence, urging them into war. He wanted most of all requital for Helen's struggles and groans. Those who lived in Pylos and lovely Arene, in Thyron, ford of Aphius, and Aepe, and Cyparissus, and Iphigenie, and Telios, and Hellas, and Dorium, where the Muses met Thamrius and stopped his song as he journeyed from Eurytus' house in Ocalia, boasting he would win even if the Muses, daughters of Zeus, were to sing against him. And in anger they maimed him, took away his melody, and silenced his lyre. All these Geranian Nestor led, and had 90 hollow ships drawn up in rows. Those held Arcadia and Gylene's shadow beside Apetus' tomb, where men fight hand to hand. And those in Phinios and Orchomenos, in Ripe and Stratia and Windy and Isbe, those who held Tegea and Mantinea, those who held Stipholis and lived in Parasia. All these Agapenor led, and Caius' son, 50 ships, and each ship had on board many Arcadians who knew how to fight. Agamemnon himself had given them ships to cross over the sea's gray wine, for Arcadians know nothing of sailing the sea. Those from Buprasium and shining Elis, and the land that Hermine and Mercinus enclosed on the coast, and between Olin Rock and Elysium, all these had 4 leaders, each with 10 ships, with many Epeans aboard. The captains were Aphimachus and Thalpius, both of Actor's line, one Ctetus' son, the other Eurytus. Third was mighty Diores, son of Amarynceus. Fourth was godlike Polyxenus, Aegea's son. Those from Dulichium and the Holy Islands, the Achines, that lie in the sea offshore from Elis, had Meges as leader, peer of Ares, whom Phyleus, dear to Zeus, had begotten, the horseman Phyleus, who once upon a time had moved to Dulichium, angry with his father. 40 black ships followed Meges to Troy. Odysseus led the proud Cephallenians who held Ithaca and forested Neriton, and those in Coclea and rugged Agilips in Xanthias and Samos, and all those who lived along the mainland coast opposite these islands. Odysseus led them, peer of Zeus in council, and 12 vermilion prows followed him to Troy. The Aetolians were led by Andraemon's son Thoas. They lived in Pleuron, Alinos, Hylene, and seaside Chalcus, and rocky Caledon. For great-hearted Oeneus' sons were gone, and he himself was dead, and blonde Meleager, who once was told to rule all Aetolia. 40 black ships followed Thoas to Troy. The Cretans were led by Idomeneus. Their cities were Gnosus and walled Gortys, Lyctus, Miletus, and lime-white Lycastus, Phaestus, Rhydium, well-peopled cities, and all who dwelled in Crete's 100 towns. Idomeneus, famed for his spear, was captain, as was Meriones, who could kill like Ares. 80 black ships sailed with them to Troy. Heracles' son Tlepolemus, a good man and big, led 9 ships from Rhodes. The Rhodians were divided into 3 contingents, Lindos, Alcius, and lime-white Chimerus. They were led by the warrior Tlepolemus, born to great Heracles by Astyochea, whom he had taken out of Ephyre, away from the river Selleus, after pillaging the cities of many a hero. But when Tlepolemus came of age in the palace, he killed his father's dear uncle, Lycymnius, a scion of Ares, then getting on in years. He quickly built a fleet, gathered a following, and took flight on the sea, threatened by the other sons and grandsons of mighty Heracles. He came to Rhodes in his painful wanderings, and his people settled in 3 regions by tribes. They were loved by Zeus, who rules gods and men, and the son of Cronos showered them with wealth. Nereus led 3 trim ships from Cyme. Nereus was the son of Aglaea and Cherops, king of Cyme, and was the handsomest man of all the Danaans who came to Troy after the flawless son of Peleus. But he was weak, and few men followed him. Those who held Nisyrus and Carpathus, Cassus and Kos, Eurypylicidae, and the Calydnian islands were led by Pheidippus and Antiphus, the 2 sons of Thalasus, Heracles' son. Their 30 vessels were drawn up in rows. Those who inhabited Pelasgian Argos and lived in Alos, Alope, and Trachis, and Helthea, and Hellas, land of fair women, and were known as Myrmidons, Hellenes, Achaeans. Achilles commanded their 50 ships. But none of them now thought of gruesome war, since there was no one to lead them into the ranks. The great sprinter lay idle in their beachhead camp, nursing his wrath because of the girl, fair-haired Briseis, whom he had taken after great effort out of Lyrnessus, when he sacked that town and leveled Thebes' walls and cut down Mynes and Epistrophus, King Evenos' sons, great warriors both. Heartsick for her and angry, Achilles lay idle, but he would rise again soon. Those in Phylace and flowering Parassus, Demeter's sanctuary, and those in Eton, mother of flocks, and Antron by the sea, and in the grasslands of Telios, all these were led by Protesilaus, while he still lived. The black earth now held him. His wife, cheeks torn, was left in Phylace. His house half built, a Dardanian killed him as he leapt from his ship, the first Greek ashore. His men were not leaderless, though they missed their leader, for Podarces marshaled them, son of Epiclus Phylactes, rich in flocks, and Protesilaus' brother. But Protesilaus was older and a better man, a hero. And though his men did not lack a leader, they yearned for him. 40 black ships followed Protesilaus to Troy. Those in Phere, beside Lake Boebus, and in Boebe, Glephyre, and well-built Ialcos, were in 11 ships led by Eumelus, Admetus' son, by a glorious woman, Alcestis, loveliest of Peleus' daughters. Those in Methone, and Thaumacia, and Malaboe, rugged Elysion, came in 7 ships led by Philoctetes, the great archer, and aboard each ship were 50 oarsmen skilled with the bow. But Philoctetes now lay in pain on an island, sacred Lemnos, where the Achaeans stranded him, afflicted with a wound from a deadly snake. He lay there in anguish. The Greeks at Troy would soon remember Lord Philoctetes. Nor were these men leaderless. Medon marshaled them, Oileus' bastard son, whom Rene bore to the pillager Oileus. Those in Trica and craggy Ithome, and those in Ocalia, Eurytus' city, were led by the two sons of Asclepius, Podalirius and Machaon. Good healers, both, with 30 vessels drawn up in rows. Those who held Ormenios and the spring Hyperiae, Asterion, Titanos' white peaks, were led by Eurypylus, Euaemon's great son. 40 black ships sailed with him to Troy. Those who held Agrisa and lived in Gertone, in Orthe, Elone, and white-bricked Olooson were led by Polypoetes, staunch in battle, son of Perithous, whom deathless Zeus begot. Gloried Hippodamia conceived Polypoetes that day, when Perithous punished the shaggy centaurs, drove them from Pelion and to the Atheses. Leontius shared the command, Canis' grandson. 40 black ships sailed with them to Troy. Gonius led 22 ships from Cephas, and with him came the Anines, Peribai, who had settled around wintry Dodona, and in the fields around the stream Titaresus, a tributary of the Peneus. Its lovely water does not mingle with Peneus' silver eddies, but glides on its surface like olive oil, a branch of Styx, the dread water of oaths. The Magnetes, who lived around Peneus and forested Pelion, were led by swift Prothus, the son of Tenthredon, in 40 black ships. These were the leaders of the Danaids.
Whew, so those names were difficult, and I'm not sure that I got all of them right, but I did my best, so it'll have to do. All right, that was a lot. That was a lot of names. It goes on for quite a few minutes, and you can see why it took me a little while to do. Also, of course, I'm wearing my special shirt of a Greek ship that says Greece that I got when I was in Greece as I believe I was 13. Very lucky. Very lucky. As I said before, now I grew this beard out for the pandemic, but for this show because I want to show what kind of beard the Greek soldiers may have had back then. But as you can see, we've got this sort of whoosh out, and you can imagine that with a Greek helmet, a Greek helmet might be able to fit over it as well. I don't have definitive proof that this is the exact style of beard, but I thought it would be cool for the show. So let's get into it with these Greeks. So I find it interesting that this part of the poem has a very definitive beginning where he stops the story and says, "Tell me now, muses, who live on Olympus, for you are goddesses and are present." And it feels to me like this part of the story is almost a magic trick of words and memorization. It's like there's a lot of things you can memorize, but all these places and names, it's crazy. And he's like, I couldn't remember this stuff unless the Olympian Muses helped me out. And then maybe you had different performers who did this in a different way, who maybe like went under a spell and maybe they were pretending, or maybe they thought they really were, or who knows. And then they begin listing the roll call here. Now, one of the things I did was I looked up the names of these people and who are listed in the role of the ships, the captains and lords. And some of them we know, and some you're going to get to know a little more if this is your first time watching this series, like Diomedes and Nestor and Odysseus, of course. We already know these guys. But there's some people who are mentioned here. So like Peneleus and Leitus. The two first guys, the Boeotians, were led by Peneleus and Leitus. Well, the two of them were twin brothers. But there's something else. They were suitors to Helen before she was married to Menelaus, which is interesting. The reason why they could be there is because if you were a suitor to Helen, then even if you weren't picked to be her husband, then you were obligated to fight for her honor. As sort of, the way to get a chance to be her boyfriend was, even if you fail, you'll still be on her side someday if she needs it. Now, that's true for most of the people in this lineup. Almost all of them were suitors to Helen. It's like they were all on The Bachelorette with her. But what that also means, it makes this more dramatic, because it means almost all of these captains and lords personally knew her, which is fascinating. Because so much of the time, you think about when men go to war, they're fighting for their wives or their moms or sons and daughters who are back there, or to rescue somebody perhaps, but they all know this woman, and they're all kind of obligated to help her as well, but maybe some of them still have a soft spot for her. Many, there's so much going on there. But the other thing that's interesting about these two guys, Peneleus and Leitus, is they both are Argonauts. They were both with Jason on the Argo, which is another famous Greek story. In fact, there's a really fun movie about it called Jason and the Argonauts, which I highly recommend. Super fun. Great Ray Harryhausen stop-motion animation. Check it out. It's classic. But the funny thing about these two traits being Argonauts and Helen's suitors, almost all of these guys have that in common. Almost all of them are previous suitors of Helen, and almost all of them have some connection with the Argo, whether they are Argonauts themselves or they're the sons of Argonauts. It's pretty interesting. It's like all the guys on the Argo came back and then became kings, and then it came back and became kings and then stayed in touch, and then all tried to marry the same girl, or their kids met all the other Argonauts, like brothers in arms kind of a thing, which is interesting because I'm not as familiar with the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and even what the circumstances of the ending is that. So I'm not sure how consistent that is with it, but I think it's interesting to think about. Now, another thing that's super cool is we've got more twins as well for Ascalaphus and Ialmenus. Let's see. And we've also got, they were also Argonauts and suitors of Helen. But one of the weird things that I found out when I was reading this stuff, so you've got names like Eliphenor and, where's the other one? Eliphenor and Amphimachus and Meges. Right, there's a bunch of names in here that have something a little odd that happens when you look them up, which is if you Google them, pictures of butterflies come up, because there are butterflies named after characters in the role of the ships, which I'm not sure why that is. I looked it up. They're not all named by the same person, but some of them are named by the student of the same guy who named this other butterfly. So apparently there's this in-joke with a lot of 17 to 1800s butterfly enthusiasts who may name butterflies after characters from Iliad, I guess, or Greek mythology anyway. Or it's just some way that Greek and Latin, I don't know how the languages work, but I just thought that was interesting. So, butterflies, fantastic. I love those things. One of the things that's interesting about Menestheus that we hear about, because a lot of these guys we don't know a lot about, but some of them you look them up and they've got their whole own story. But Menestheus, who was a great king of Athens, he knew Helen's brothers. Helen of Sparta, right? He knew her brothers, and they were the ones who made him king. So again, he knows her, and he's obligated to help her as well. He knows these guys. This is also when we hear about Menelaus, who says he most of all wants requital for Helen's struggles and groans. That's a clear motivation. He's emotionally invested here. He's upset that she's upset. Apparently he knows that, or thinks that. We'll see. But that's an insight to his character that we get to have a look at. Polyxenus named his son Amphimachus after his closest friend Amphimachus. It's another just detail there that's fascinating to me, that's in this. Agapenor, another suitor, and Argonaut. Another Greek myth that a lot of these characters have in common are the Caledonian boar hunt, which is its own story, which, like Jason and the Argonauts, I encourage you to look up. Maybe I'll cover it sometime on this channel if I do that again, but we'll see. But the Caledonian boar hunt is something that a bunch of these characters have in common. We also have Idomeneus killed 3 Amazons, including Bremusa, which is interesting because we hear about how eventually in the Trojan War there are Amazons who show up to fight on the side of the Trojans, but we also know that there are certain characters who killed more of those. Idomeneus has a really sad story because at one point he's coming back from Troy and he's caught in this horrible, horrible storm, and he prays and says to, I forget if he's talking to Poseidon or Zeus, but he says, if you let me live, I will sacrifice the first thing I see to you when I get home. And of course, the first thing he sees when he gets back home is his son. Terrible. And he does sacrifice him, and of course this makes the gods angry, and they punish him soundly for it. One of the ones I have to talk the most about, because it's just the craziest story, is Protesilaus, the first Greek ashore, who's the first one to die. There was an oracle who prophesied this, and the Greeks knew that the first one ashore was going to die. So why did he jump out and be the first? Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because when the Greeks took their ships across the wine dark sea, they all knew the prophecy of the oracle that the first Greek ashore would be the first to fall. And so when they came to the shore, none leapt out of the ships, for they were all afraid that they would be the first to fall. But then Odysseus threw his shield out of the ship onto the beach. He leapt from his ship and onto his shield rather than the sand. And then the other Greeks, seeing him ashore, leapt out, and the first to leap out was Protesilaus. I'm still not sure if I'm getting his name right, but you get it. But since Odysseus' feet did not touch the ground, since they were on his shield, Protesilaus was the first Greek ashore. And in the ensuing fight, he was killed by Hector. And as we read, his wife lacerated her cheeks with her nails. She was so overcome with grief that even the gods felt for her and brought Protesilaus back from the underworld so she could see him one last time. But then, when the time was up, they brought him back to the underworld, and she could not bear the grief. She had a bronze statue made in the likeness of her husband, and she devoted herself to it and presented herself to that statue in all the devoted ways that a wife does to a husband. She fed the statue, she slept with the statue, she did everything for this statue of her dead husband. And when her father saw what she was doing with this bronze statue, he took it from her and cast it into the fire so that it would be melted down. And as the statue was melting in the fire, she cast herself upon it and burned and died with that statue. Horrible tragedy. Protesilaus' tomb was built when his remains were brought back to Greece. And it was said that great elm trees, taller than any others in the known world, grew on top of his tomb until the very topmost branches, looking over the wine-dark sea, could see the ruins of Troy. But once they reached that height and saw the ruins of Troy, those elm trees withered instantly. Now, many years pass, and we start to leave mythology and go more into history, because Xerxes of Persia, who you may know, famously fought against 300 Spartans, and I think it was 700 Thespians, at a little pass called Thermopylae in 480 BC. There was a man with Xerxes who wanted to raid Protesila's tomb, and Xerxes gave him permission. But when the Greeks caught that man, they had him executed, and they took the treasure and put it back in the tomb. Many more years later, and we're really into history now, Alexander the Great, who was one of the biggest fans of Iliad, came to Protesila's tomb before his campaign into Asia. He made a sacrifice at the tomb, praying that he would not have the same fate as Protesilaus, because he took the first step into Asia on his campaign out of all his soldiers. He was the first to set foot there, and he did not want to follow the same fate. Also, he was a big fan, and I'm sure he just wanted to see the tomb, so there's that. But it's so interesting to see. We've got the story of Iliad, and then we go all the way to Xerxes being around and Alexander the Great. It's fascinating to me. Even that, let's see, where was it? I passed it earlier. The tombs of Ascalaphus and Ialmenus, their tombs were around into Roman times, which is crazy to think about, that we have tombs of these people from this story. I mean, I suppose it could have been set up as a fake tourist attraction, but maybe it's just one of those things where we just barely missed some of the evidence for what really happened in the story that this poem is based on. Because we have the ruins of Troy. We know where it is, and we've dug down enough that we know that there was some type of a battle or siege around the time that this was supposed to happen. And the whole premise of this show started off by saying, what if 1,000 years from now there's a kid who wonders if Captain America was a real person, perhaps exaggerated, larger than life, but based on a real man. I'm seeing that's more possible here. Protesilaus was also a suitor of Helen, as you may have guessed. Now, the other figure that we need to talk about is Philoctetes, who is the archer who's been bitten by a horrible snake and left on the island of Lemnos. His story is very interesting because it goes back to Heracles. Philoctetes had favor with Heracles because he helped him die. He lit his funeral pyre. Because of this, he had favor with Heracles, and Heracles gave him his bow and his poisoned arrows. Crazy. And it was, as to how he was bitten by the snake is a little, there's like 4 different versions of this story, because there were like 4 different plays written about him, only one of which has survived. And the one that makes the most sense to me personally is the idea that Hera did not like that Philoctetes helped Heracles, because Hera hated Heracles, and so she sent a snake to bite him, which is sort of her MO, because she sent snakes to attack Heracles when he was a baby, so it's sort of like her move anyway. The one tragedy that has been written that has survived the test of time is called Sophocles' Philoctetes. Now, the fun thing about all this is that the Greeks had kidnapped Helenus, who told them under torture that in order to win the Trojan War, the Greeks had to have Hercules' bow and arrows. Now, this is interesting. Helenus, by the way, is, I believe, the son of Priam, who has some capabilities as a seer, so he would know. And of course, the Greeks who had stranded Philoctetes on that island are like, oh snap, we gotta go get that bow. But he had been there for 10 years with this snake bite. Now, as to why he was stranded there, like why the Greeks would do that, it's not really clear. I don't know why. I tried finding out. I don't know. But whatever it was, Odysseus was involved. And as far as we know, Odysseus is the reason why Philoctetes was stranded on Lemnos. 10 years later, Odysseus and Diomedes go back to Lemnos to try and find the bow. They find Philoctetes alive there, and Odysseus wants to take the bow and just scram with it. But Diomedes, good guy, Diomedes is like, we're not leaving without this Philoctetes guy. And Philoctetes is crazy because one of the versions of the story, this is a spoiler alert to, actually I'm not going to say this because it is a spoiler alert and it doesn't say this in the epic poem. So for those of you who have watched the story, just go into the description and look down there. I'll put a little thing that I'll say Philoctetes in all caps, and I'll put the spoiler in there so that it's not ruined for anybody in this video. But it's like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. So it has to do with the end. So check it out, what that guy's up to. But this whole section in the ships where it talks about Philoctetes and how the Greeks would soon remember him, that's what it's talking about. It's not an Iliad, but it's part of the epic cycle. It's part of the whole story. So it's foreshadowing for another poem, which is so crazy that these are all so connected because they were written or rehearsed and memorized before the text was standardized at the Library of Alexandria by the men who are credited in the opening credits of this show. There's a little side note here also because some of these characters, of course, talks about their fathers and mothers. And one of the most interesting ones I found is that Perithous was, he's gone because it talks about how Polypoetes, staunch in battle, son of Perithous, whom deathless Zeus begot, and he talks about he was conceived on this specific night, which is actually important because Perithous is stuck in the underworld. He tried to kidnap Persephone from Hades, and he's stuck there. So basically, Perithous had a very narrow window of opportunity to have a son, and he took it. And the whole story about him chasing away the centaurs is that the centaurs were at his wedding. And then the centaurs got drunk and tried to carry off all the women, and it turned into a fight, and the centaurs lost. So there you go. Centaurs. Rowdy bunch, I guess, in Greek mythology. All this to say that the Greeks had a force of 142,320 men, which is a lot of people, especially when you consider that's fighting men. Something that's remained fairly consistent throughout history is that for every man at the front, there's 100 people behind the lines making it possible for that one man to be there. Talking about smiths, talking about armorers, talking about cooks, medics, the squires, people looking after the animals, all that stuff. You're looking at almost 100 people per guy in most of human history for like a well-outfitted army. Now, of course, this is on a beach where they have ships going back and forth all the time. So maybe it's not 100 per person because they've got more of an infrastructure set up, especially after 10 years. But it's a lot. Now, the other thing is you may have heard a very famous phrase that Helen had the face that launched 1,000 ships. And turns out she launched 1,186 ships. Crazy. So she must have been beautiful, but we also see these people were contractually obligated to help her out, which I think is kind of funny. Now, the next section that we're going to go about is the battle order of the Trojans. And there's a little less commentary on that, but I've got a little bit more for you, so let's go there. For the battle order of the Trojans, it is Book 2, line 937 that we are picking up. And that goes until the end of the book.
In front of the city, there is a steep hill out in the plain, level terrain all around it. Men call this hill Bechaea. Immortals call it the Barrow of Myrine, the dancer. It was here that the Trojans and their allies drew up their troops in companies. The Trojans were led by great Hector, son of Priam, in his shining helmet. His contingent was far the largest and the best, arrayed for battle, resolute with their spears. The Dardanian troops were led by Aeneas, whom bright Aphrodite bore to Anchises, a goddess lying with a mortal man in the foothills of Ida. Sharing the command were Antenor's two sons, Archelicus and Acamas, skilled in all forms of combat. The Tros, who lived in wealthy Zelea at Ida's foot and drank the Asipus dark water, were led by the glorious son of Lycaon, Pandarus, whose bow was a gift from Apollo. Those who held Adrastea, the Demiapesus, and Patea, and the steep Mount Terea, were led by Adrastus and Amphius, with linen corselets, son of Merops and Procote. This man knew divination and forbade his sons to go to war, but they would not listen, for death's black birds were calling them on. Those who lived around Procote and Practios, who held Cestus and Abydos and bright Arisbe, were led by Asius, Hertacides, a born leader, Asius, whom his great chestnut horses had drawn from Arisbe and the river Celius. The Pelasgian tribes, ferocious spearmen from fertile Larissa, were led by Harpithus with his brother Pylaeus. They were sons of Pelasgian Lethus, grandsons of Tautomus. Acamas and Parius led all the Thracians beyond the strong current of the Hellespont. Euphemus captained the Ciconian spearmen, son of Trojanus and grandson of Chaos. Pericles led the distant Paeonians with curved bows from Amydon and the river Axius, whose water flows fairest over the earth. Pylaemenes, shaggy heart, led the Paphlagonians from the land of Anete, where the mules run wild. Their cities were Citaros and Sesamos, and they lived around the river Pathenios, in Cromnia, Egalios, High Ethrene, Odius, and Epistrophus led the Halizones from distant Alybe, ancient source of silver. The Mysians were led by Chromis and Anomus, who foretold the future from the flight of birds, but could not ward off the black birds of death. They would be slain in the river by the terrible sword of swift Achilles, Aeacus' grandson, when he killed many there. Phorcys and Ascanius led Phrygians from distant Ascania, battle-hungry troops. The Meonians were led by Mesthales and Antiphus, Taliamon's sons, whose mother was the nymph of Lake Gigea under Mount Tmolus. Nastes led the Carians, who spoke a foreign tongue. Their strongholds were Miletus and Mount Phthyres, the streams of Meander and Mycale's steep crests. Amphimachus shared the command with Nastes, who came to the war wearing gold like a girl. The fool! But it could not save him from death. Achilles killed him in his rush through the river without a second thought and bore off the gold. Sarpedon and Glaucus captained the Lycians, who came from the faraway, swirling Xanthus.
And there you have it. Now, when it comes to the Trojans, I wasn't able to find as much about these particular gentlemen, but turns out there's some interesting things. Some of these guys were also Argonauts, which is more fascinating because some of these guys used to be shipmates and now they're fighting against each other. That's just insane. For those of you who have sharper ears, some of you might have noticed that some of these names are repeats. So some of the names in the Trojan side are the same as the names on the Greek side. Now, of course, you're going to have people named John or Joe or Harold or Marjorie on both sides of any army. But here's the funny thing that I found out about the ships, which is there's two things that are pretty fascinating about the ships. One is that it might be the most accurate part of the entire epic poem, because there are places and names here which correspond not to the time that Homer was alive, but to the time before Homer was supposed to be alive. So it's an old map, which people sometimes argue Homer could not have known about unless it was based on something older. Now, that's one of the cool things about why it might be the most accurate of however accurate this whole thing is, part of the epic poem, but we also think it might be the most inaccurate part of the epic poem because some of these names could be the names of sponsors and benefactors. Just today, like if you have a Patreon account or something on YouTube, or just the special thanks credits, if you were to sponsor someone who was giving these epic poem orations, then you could get in the ships, or you could get in the Trojan lines. That was for sale sometimes, which is hilarious to me. And in fact, I thought if I ever start a Patreon on this channel, I would call it The Ships, and we'd just have, you know, it would be based on that. But, you know, I wasn't ever really good. But it's interesting to see how almost nothing's changed. You've still got sponsorships, you've still got benefactors. It's all the same stuff. The world used to work the same way. Just, it's crazy. So I think that's so awesome. Something else I want to bring up about all this is that all the forces are broken up by tribe or nation or village. Like, it's set up like that. We're not mixing in the groups, which makes me think again of World War I, where, once again, obviously World War I is not an inspiration for Iliad, but perhaps Iliad inspired some of the ideas in World War I. That would be arguable. But here's the crazy thing. The reason why I bring up the First World War here is because there's something called the PALS battalions. And the way that worked is that, like in Britain, okay, if you were all from the same town, then you'd all be in the same unit, because the idea was if you all knew each other, you'd fight harder for your friends and work as a better group. But the problem with that in World War I versus ancient warfare was that on a modern battlefield, you could lose an entire unit in a day. So after the war, what happened is that town suddenly had no men anymore. And that's something that Great Britain's culture still has not fully recovered from. When you have more than dozens and dozens of towns where all the men have died, or all but 4 of the men have died, that takes such a huge toll on your culture and just the entire mindset and trauma of a people, so that even in the Olympic Games, when Britain was hosting, during the opening ceremonies, they have this huge moment of silence for the First World War. But here we've got people divided into their groups, because you'd fight, you'd hit spears together, but it was unlikely that all of you were gonna die. And so the idea of being with your buddies and everybody that you know maybe made sense back then. But it's something to I just thought that was interesting to bring up. So, alright everybody, I think that's about it for the ships and the battle order, unless I pop in here once again without a beard for a second to tell you one last thing I just remembered, and the lighting might change. Okay, so I'm back real quick. I just thought it was really interesting that at first they mentioned Achilles, and then right after that, Protesilaus. Now, there's 2 possible reasons for this. One is because the names listed in the role of the ships in general follow a sort of logic geographically to the way that they're introduced. It's actually divided into 3 sections, which it's argued that these are based on ethnic guidelines, but either way, this shows that there's an order in mind. It's not based alphabetically, it's not based really on importance or who has the most ships or anything like that. There's a bigger picture going on here. So that's cool. Once again, it follows an older map design for that. But I also think it's really interesting that it shows Achilles and then Protesilaus right after. because those are two very different characters with different results for war, or they exemplify two different ideas in Iliad, which are in conflict with each other, which I talk about more in the rest of the series. But you have the great, glorified, amazing hero Achilles, and then you have this sort of isolated tragedy with Protesilaus and his wife and all the rest of it. But I talk about that more in the series, but I thought it would be really interesting to mention here. Okay, back to the show. I've been thinking about how I'm going to end this particular episode, because for some of you, this is just the next one on a playlist, and for some of you, you're coming back after having finished the show. For those of you who have finished the whole show, thank you so much for being with me, whether it was on the live streams during the pandemic. I can't tell you how cool that was to see the same people in the group chat twice a week. It really was awesome, because on the one hand, it gave me something to do and a way to hang out with people during the pandemic, and it was just something I found interesting and I was passionate about. I really wanted to share. And during the pandemic, like a lot of you, I felt pretty hopeless as to what I could do about anything. Like, I just wanted to be able to do something, and I couldn't really do much of anything other than stay in my house and not do anything. And so, you know, as an artist and entertainer and all that, I just thought I'd throw my hat into the ring during the pandemic and just try to throw a few videos out there for people to, you know, forget for a while, I guess. And it became really special to me. So if you were there for the live streams, thank you. If you've watched this show since then, thank you again. I have been so floored by how many people have found this show and watched it, and the comments of people saying that they use it for their classes, or that like whether they're students or they're studying, or whether they're teachers, or they're just people who find this kind of thing interesting. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad that so many people are enjoying it. I really thought, on the one hand, Iliad's pretty niche, but I didn't realize that anyone else was really going to find it interesting enough to watch all the live streams or to continue watching it afterward. People that I don't even know. So I just wanted to say thank you very much, and I am going to say something that I don't think I said for the entire show. And this is my last chance, and for those of you watching the playlist, it's early on, so this is when you're going to get it. If you like this show, it would be real cool if you subscribed. That's all. I don't know what liking the videos does or commenting, but I will say if you comment, there's a really good chance I'm going to reply to it, because I love getting comments. I love reading them, and I try to reply to all of them. And this channel's small enough that I can do that. So thank you all for joining me for this final, air quotes, Peter Presents. For those of you who are just getting started on this series, I hope you enjoy it. I've been pleased to know that many people have enjoyed it quite a bit. And if there's one thing I'm proud of with this show, is that I accomplished what I wanted to do, which is to bring Iliad to people in a way that got across the immediacy and the visceral nature of this book that makes it so fresh for me even today. And enough people have told me that now they get it, which is incredibly humbling, that some guy like me, not a professor, not an expert, just a fan, like Alexander the Great, but without a great at the end of my name, was able to help someone appreciate something more that I love so much. So I hope I do that for you. And if you don't like the show by this point, it's not going to get a whole lot different, so you can stop now. But that's that. Now I have to address something else. A bunch of you have asked about Odyssey. Yes, I will be doing Odyssey. However, that's a long way off for a few reasons. One, I want to get some more content out to you guys a bit faster. I want to do a couple of one-off episodes that are just about specific things that I can present on this show as one-off episodes rather than a longer series, which I will be getting to. Now, some of you have asked what I've been doing since I haven't been uploading to this channel. Well, things have been going actually pretty well for me lately. My filmmaking's picking up finally a lot more. I'm really excited about that. Things are going super well. I've also moved, got married, and shaved. And if you want to follow everything that I do, all of this show, my filmmaking, podcasts, other types of content creation, just everything that I'm doing, then I've got a Facebook page, which is for my LLC, which you can find a link in the description below. If this show's enough for you, stick with the show, but if you just want to know what else I do and more of it, then check that out. Love to have you follow my content and you'll see what's going on. So there's that. Also, of course I'm drinking out of a mug today. And look, it's got a ship on it because we're doing the ships. Awesome. Thanks a lot for sticking with me. It's been a real fun time. I loved doing this. And it means so much to me that there was even one other person who liked it, let alone, actually at this point it's been hundreds, which it's just a little tear in my eye. Alright everybody, enjoy the rest of the show. Leave a comment. I'll probably talk to you. And it's been a pleasure.